Hi everybody, I'm Katherine Hunt and I'm going to give you my paper today, which is called More Lasting Than Bronze, Bells, Writing and the Poetics of Metal Casting in Post-Reformation England. I'd like to start by considering this image from June 2020, which is probably familiar to you. It's of the bronze statue of the slave trader Edward Colston being dumped into Bristol Harbour. This year's Black Lives Matter protests, we have brought new attention to that problem of public monuments, which honour people who we now think deserve kind of infamy rather than fame. These public statues are often, but not always, made of bronze. This one is, you can see here. Bronze is a really good material for monuments because it's durable, it doesn't rust, and it also has a really long-standing connection to the human body. So from at least the ancient Greeks onwards, the ancient Greeks really thought that bronze had qualities very similar to human flesh and human skin. So Colston's splash into the harbour that we see here was a really dramatic moment of this tumultuous year. It was a really decisive, really violent action that aimed to obliterate the importance that had been assigned to this man. Something that this year's statue discourse hasn't engaged with that much, however, is the processes by which bronze can be melted down and reformed. Which is in some ways an even more decisive method of destruction than the kind of dumping it in the harbour. Making a statue in bronze involves making a mould, heating up the metal until it's molten, and then pouring it in. If the process is done well, then the statue comes out whole and fully formed. So the Italian founder Vannocchio Biringuccio, in his treatise Della Pyrotechnia, which he published in 1540, described how totally the metal has to be melted. He said it must be made entirely liquid like water or oil, spread out and clear in the furnace. And he continues, he says that you need to find that it flashes like the sun and see that the flames which still issue are almost white and without smoke. It's a really total annihilation of form, which allows the matter of the metal to be remade. I want to talk today about the resonances of bronze in 17th century English writing, which take up some of these qualities. First of all, though, a note about bronze. So this metal is a mixture of copper and tin, which is now described by the word bronze. The English language borrowed this word bronze from Romance languages, but not until the 18th century. So early modern English used instead the word brass to describe all copper alloys, so including copper and zinc, which we now call brass, and also copper and tin, which we now call bronze. So I'll be talking about early modern uses of the word brass, which referred to bronze, among other things. The title of my paper comes from Horace's Ode number 30. I have built myself, I have finished a monument more lasting than bronze, more lofty than the regal structure of the pyramids, one which neither corroding rain nor the ungovernable north wind can ever destroy, nor the countless series of the years, nor the flight of time. Horace is talking about his own writing here, and the opposition he sets out, so writing versus bronze, uses bronze as a foil. So bronze seems to be so solid and so durable, but is actually nothing compared to the lastingness of literary production and literary fame. Renaissance writers returned again and again to Horace's quote and to the comparison of writing with these other durable materials, including bronze. So Shakespeare's sonnets, for example, they constantly play with what kinds of immortality writing can offer, as compared to bronze, stone, earth, or to the gilded monuments of princes. And these are examples from sonnet 65 and sonnet 55. However, for other English Renaissance writers, bronze was useful in a way that went against Horace's proclamation. So by positioning bronze as an analogue to, rather than a foil for writing, these writers were able to think through questions of literary creation and skill. Because bronze was an alloy, it had to be made. This linked it to the kind of artisanal or makerly qualities of writing, because a poet, following the word's root in the Greek word poiein, was a maker. The recyclability of bronze gave it these really profound connections to humanist processes of writing and of reading. I want to call this the poetics of bronze casting. So the creation of a new alloy from two metals, the collapse of times, of temporalities that happened in the reuse of ancient and medieval matter in a new object, The narrative of loss, perhaps, that's always present when you cast a positive object from a negative mould. In bronze casting, there's always loss. So loss of the old form, of the kind of old bits of metal that you put in and melt, and change of the metal itself from solid to liquid to metal again. But there's always something new created too. So a new form that's a kind of regeneration, but which is always potentially subject to relapse. It could always go back into the furnace again. So I want to focus on a particular type of bronze object, the large church or tower bell. So European bells, including English ones, were commonly figured as subjects. They had names, they were sometimes in the Catholic Church baptized, they had tongues, collars, they had shoulders, they had inscriptions written around their bodies in which they kind of spoke in the first person. This is a 14th century bell from a church in Essex, which bears an inscription to St. Juliana, and it was in use in that church until probably the 19th century. And these objects had a remarkable survival in the post-Reformation English church. Despite various theoretical attacks on them, and unlike lots of other medieval religious objects, they tended to avoid destruction and remain in use. So some were melted down, but others were redistributed. So monastery bells were sometimes redistributed to parish churches, for example. The writers I'm going to discuss now, John Donne and Richard Corbett, as well as other contemporaries in the latter's circle, made use of the potentially fluid nature of these durable bronze objects to think about cycles of life and death and the kind of generative possibilities of destruction. They use the poetics of metal casting to comment, sometimes directly, on post-Reformation material survivals. They're writing in the 1620s, and this is a period in which bell founding was coming back to life. So in the 16th century, this was characterized by sort of sneaky reuse of bells, where monastery bells were given to parish churches. By the turn of the 17th century, bells had established a secure place in the church. Their numbers were beginning to be multiplied, and importantly, they were being cast again. The poet and bishop Richard Corbett was Dean of Christ Church College, Oxford from 1620 to 28, and then Bishop of Oxford from 1628 to 1632. In a clutch of these widely commonplace poems, he and his imitators commemorate the recasting of important bells, including the Great Tom Bell at Christ Church College, which was probably in 1626. The history of this bell encapsulates the reuse and reformation of old bells. It was taken after the dissolution of the monasteries from Osney Abbey, just west of Oxford, to St. Friedeswide's Church, which became Christ Church Cathedral in 1546. It hung there through most of the 17th century, and then in 1682, it was installed in the gateway tower of Christ Church, where it remains. So the name of this bell continued, and much of the metal of this bell continued, but actually the bell underwent many, many recastings during this period. And in Corbett's poem, that one of the refoundings of this giant old bell in 1626 is refigured as a rebirth. So today, writes Corbett, of the day in which the bell was recast, is young Tom's resurrection from the clay. And the poem continues, I have it up here on the screen. Old Tom's grown young again. The fiery cave is now his cradle that was erst his grave. He grew up quickly from his mother earth, for all you see is not an hour's birth. Look on him well, my life I dare engage, you never saw a prettier baby of his age. These lines push metaphors of birth and death to their limit for comic effect. The bell founder's furnace, that's the fiery cave, just like Biringuccio's, acts as both grave and cradle. In melting, the bell dies, and yet this change of state is what allows it to be reborn. The bell is buried in the ground, his mother earth, and at the end of the poem, the bell, described as a kind of a martyr, dies another death when put back in the tower. So we'll all be glad, great Tom, the poem continues, to see thee hanged. So meaning hanging up as in the bell tower rather than being hung up to be killed. So in a reversal, even a lampoon of the genre of the child elegy, death is celebrated at every stage as an improvement, making the bell prettier and younger, and when hung again in the tower, a source of gladness for everybody. If there is any mourning here at all, it is for the monastic foundation from which the bell originally came. So a few stanzas later, Corbett addresses the ruined Osney Abbey. Never grieve, old Osney, at thy heavy fall. Thy relics build thee up again. They all flourish to thy great glory. Their sole fame, when thou art not, will keep great Osney's name. This passage is formally more disjointed than elsewhere in the regular rhyming pentameter of this poem. Caesurae signal the separated parts, like the bells that have been taken away and separated after the dissolution. The abbey's scattered bells, so Osney is of giant bells, the famous treasury, Corbett says elsewhere. They operate as the monastery's legacy. So Tom's eldest brothers are the bells now hanging in Westminster Abbey, Lincoln and Exeter, and are all descendants that continue the family name in some way. The bells work not only to memorialise the abbey, but also as a kind of material recreation of the ruin. So they're relics that build thee up again. Here, it's matter or metal that carries identity rather than form. As we know, in bronze objects, form is subject to ruin at any time, but vitality endures in the metal and is both sort of displayed and renewed in these moments of Reformation. Another poem, To the Bell Founder of Great Tom of Christ Church in Oxford, is probably by another writer in Corbett's coterie, again praises the power of casting and the bell founder's skill. The founder is thou that by ruin dost repair, and are by destruction made a founder, whose art doth tell us what men are, who by corruption shall rise sounder. And we can see here something like a kind of echo of Biringuccio's description of his work, that kind of destruction in order to create. So these poems are pretty bad, let's be honest, but the stages of bronze casting here provide a narrative structure to the purifying and strengthening process of a crisis. This is important in a much more serious work of the 1620s too. That's John Donne's Devotions upon Emergent Occasions, published in 1624. In this work, which is a series of 23 devotions, each made up of a meditation, expostulation, and a prayer, Donne recounts his almost fatal sickness of 1623. The one thing that everybody knows about the devotions is the bell bits. So it's here that we're implored not to ask for whom the bell tolls, because it tolls for thee. So bells are absolutely at the heart of this text, in some ways literally, and because they form the focus of the three central devotions, numbers 16 to 18, in which Donne's fever peaks and then breaks. There's been lots of interesting work on the bell's sounds and meanings, but I want to talk about how they operate in the devotions as meltable or potentially meltable bronze objects, and ones that work as analogues to the human body and soul. So in a series of passages in the devotions, Donne links health and sickness to sculptural process. He figures God as the true artisan, and melting, represented in the body as fever, as one of the divine processes of bodily and spiritual reformation. The sick man, he writes, feels that a fever doth not melt him like snow, but pour him out like lead, like iron, like brass melted in a furnace. That's the final part of this quotation here. So a fever is able to effect radical transformation. Rather than melting the man like snow, which as water can easily just slip away, it pours him out like lead, iron, or brass melted in a furnace. Donne's list of molten metals serves to show the power of the fever, able to reduce all of these metals, the heavy lead, the strong iron, and this kind of resonant brass, into a fluid state. The fever pours in a deliberate action intended not just to destroy, but also to reform. So elsewhere in the devotions, Donne is very aware of what new forms bells might take. He pays particular attention to the way in which bells as molten brass are poured into other molds and become something else. So when the Turks took Constantinople, he writes, they melted the bells into ordnance. So political and religious conversion is reflected in this significant change of form when Turkish forces took bells and made them into cannon. And bells and cannon were materially equivalent, so made from the same variety of bronze. The symbols of peace and war exchanged and transformed into one another. Fever is analogous to the melting of metal, like that melting that we saw earlier that Biringuccio performs. It causes Donne to feel like brass melted in a furnace. In what the critic Raby Targoff calls the transitional moments of fever and sickness, God seems more accessible or present than during Donne's normal life, says Targoff. This transitional period, which is full of possibility, is for Targoff the location of something really important in the devotions. She writes, the delight of being thrust in the middle of the crisis, of witnessing the vicissitudes of falling and rising, of understanding the struggle of sickness as something imaginatively and devotionally productive. Just like in Corbett's poem, these transitional moments are full of potential and possibility for reformation as a kind of rebirth. And Donne returns again and again to sculptural metaphors, and particularly those to do with casting, to describe the bodily and spiritual renewal he seeks. Let God mould me and then melt me again. Let him make me and then break me again, he writes in a sermon on the penitential Psalms. He goes willingly to be reformed over and over. God is the artisan here, and sickness or melting is the process that God performs in this work. So those cycles of dissolution and reformation are like bronze casting, in which the matter can be broken completely and remade without loss. Both Donne and in a different way Corbett make use of the possibilities of such cycles in a way that contradicts Horace's pronouncement about the eventual destruction of bronze. When, as these writers encourage, we think about the regenerative possibilities of bronze, it makes us question what lasting might mean. If what lasts is not form but matter, bronze helps us to understand the kind of durability that has as at its heart not fixity but process, which rewards serious and careful work. For the High Churchman Corbett, this recyclability helped him to come to terms with the material ruin of the Reformation. For Donne, who's always concerned about what's going to happen after death, the reformable bells operated as a reassurance that his own bodily and spiritual crisis was in fact a process of strengthening. The two examples I've given from the early 17th century give another meaning to bronze, emphasising the generative possibilities of destruction, a different kind of possibility to that dramatic, satisfying dump of Colston into Bristol Harbour. Donne and Corbett show in their own ways the belief that catastrophe could give rise to a newer and a happier form over and over again.